Okay, we're broadcasting, and we'll see if some folks jump. Oh man, they're jumping in. I guess they want to hear from Mike Reagan.
I even tweeted out I'm going to be with you.
Cool, great.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people canceled me.
Oh, that's right. You know, as people join in here, I'll just let them know next week I'm going to speak with Kelly Shackelford. Mike, have you ever met Kelly?
Well, I believe I have, yeah.
Okay. Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty. We're going to talk about what's going on with religious liberty these days. We're going to talk about what's going on with the courts. Might even discuss with Mike the importance today of all the new judges, all the empty judgeships that have been filled over the past couple of years. So we're going to talk with Kelly next week, and the following week I'm going to talk with Patricia Heaton, and actress. She's had a little bit of success, and she probably falls in line with some things where Michael and I are, and sweet gal, person of faith. So in 2 weeks, we're going to talk to Patty Heaton. But today, my guest, ladies and gentlemen, is the one and only Michael Edward Reagan. And I won't say what year you were born, but you're known as an American television personality, political commentator, strategist, former radio talk show host, and author. And Mike is the adopted son of President Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman. Mike, welcome to the conversation today.
I prove adoption works.
There you go. And we'll get
there you go. Hey, without adoption, the Reagans have no conservative child. What can I tell you?
So people should adopt as much as possible?
Absolutely, don't stop.
Is there any guarantee if you adopt that the child is going to be a conservative? or is that up in the air?
It's always up in the air, always up in the air.
Okay. Yeah. By the way, I've got a chat open here if folks want to jump in and write a question. I've got a bunch of questions here. Most of them are not very good, but if you have a question and you want to submit to Mike Reagan.
You want to know how this all happened, me getting adopted? My sister Maureen, who is 4 years my senior, we lost her in 2001 to melanoma, 60 years old, sad. But all of her friends had brothers, older brothers, and she thought all boys were older. And her mom and dad, Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan, who would become my mom and dad, they were Schwab's Pharmacy on Sunset Boulevard. And Maureen, who was 3 at the time, walks up to the pharmacist and she puts 97 cents on the counter. And the pharmacist says, "What do you want, little girl?" And Maureen said, "I want a brother." Embarrassed the heck out of Jane and Ronald, right? But, you know, they started talking because back then in Hollywood, you couldn't be pregnant and work because it meant you had sex on camera or whatever. But it really did. You couldn't be a woman and be pregnant and actually have a job acting. So there was a lot of us adopted into Hollywood families back then. And so what happened was they decided to adopt. And there was this young girl from Portsmouth, Ohio, who had become pregnant by a married guy. And he had taken off and joined the military as soon as he found out she was pregnant. Mm. And Irene chased him to Arizona. And he got in some trouble during basic training. Mm-hmm. They sent him to France for the war. And he had $600 in his pocket, gave $400 to Irene, who came to California and did what most young girls do when they come to California, try to get in the acting business. And she found out that Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman were looking to adopt a child. And she called Jane on the phone. And Jane told her, "If it's a boy, call me." And 55 hours of labor later, she ends up giving birth to me, calling Jane, goes and visits Jane, or Jane visits her at the hospital, Queen of Angels Hospital in Los Angeles. That big white building that you see now as the Dream Center was a hospital. And Jane goes to see her. She places me, and she says, I want to place you in the arms of the woman who's going to be your mother, and gives me to Jane. And I come home from the hospital 3 days later. Maureen is just beside herself with excitement, runs upstairs, gets her piggy bank. She can't get the cork out of the bottom of the piggy bank, throws it on the floor, breaks it, grabs 97 cents off the floor, runs downstairs and gives it to the people who brought me home from the hospital.
No.
That's how I got into the Reagan family.
Okay, so your birth mother searched out when she heard that they were interested in adopting?
Yeah, Ronald Reagan, Jane Wyman were the big deal of that era.
Yeah.
You know, Mom would win the Academy Award for Best Actress 3 years later. She had already been nominated. And so they were the big to-do in Hollywood back in, in the 40s. And she searched them out, found out they were looking for a child. Army Archer, remember Army? Army Archer, Daily Variety. He was the first man I ever saw because he was there. It was a big event. I mean, everybody was at the house when I came in from the hospital and showed up at the Reagan residence, if you will.
You know, Christine and I were watching a documentary the other night about your dad, and they told how your mom and dad, they were the item. They were really quite something for Hollywood. People looked at they were major stars, major icons.
Oh yeah, a lot of people don't know. People always talk to me about my dad, but he's only got one star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Mom's got 2. All right. She also has handprints and footprints at Grandma's Chinese. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1948, Johnny Belinda, nominated for the Yearling. Best Picture that she won that picture won Ray Milland. And she won that, I think, or that was won, I think, in 1944 or 45. I'm not sure. And then Best Song with Bing Crosby, 1951, in the Cool, Cool, Cool the Evening. So she was really something. And Dad, president of the Screen Actors Guild, and what have you. It's kind of interesting. I tell people who always talk to me about my parentage, I said only 2 people were ever born and or raised in a family where the father would go on to become president of the United States and the mother would become an Academy Award-winning actress. Nobody else lived that life. And so I guess that's why people always ask me, how was it growing up with the Reagans? I go, well, not bad.
Did you stay in touch with your birth mother, or what are your first remembrances of your birth mother being involved in your life?
I never met Irene. Irene died on Christmas Day, 1985. We never met. I have a picture of her, of course, at the house, but her other son, Barry Lang, we're phenomenal friends. We're great football fans, college football fans. And we met in 1987. He flew out here and we spent 3 days together. And we're talking during football season, 57 times a week, if you will. Barry, interesting enough, was one of the head writers on Laverne and Shirley when he was 21 years of age. He introduced Babaloo Mandel and Barry to each other. And at 21 years of age, he says there's all these drugs are coming into Hollywood. I had to make a choice, put it up my nose or leave. Chose to leave.
Really?
Went back to Ohio, lives in Columbus, Ohio, manages a bunch of stores back there. And I was back there last year visiting him, went to a Ohio State game at the Shoe, blackout night. I took him to a Notre Dame game the year before, SC Notre Dame, so it was a return of favor, if you will. But we were great friends. His first cousin would be my first cousin on my birth mother's side. I tried to make feel guilty a couple of years ago. She came to a speech I gave in Pittsburgh. Yeah. Aunt Flo. She had won the Powerball, single winner of the Powerball at 65. Won $150 million.
No.
Oh, she cleared like 98 million. And she came to my speech, and I said, Aunt Flo, so good to meet you. And I said, I have no ill feelings that your family gave me away. And I said, but the people you gave me to are gone. And I said, I'm back available. I said, I'm willing to come back, take my birth name back. become John L. Flower. That was my birth name.
Yeah.
And take it back. And I don't want much from you, just a stipend for doing it. She said no. So I stayed with Mike Reagan.
Okay, so your birth mother gave you a name, and then then Jane and your dad gave you the name Michael.
Which is normal. I was born John L. Flower, and 3 days later I was Michael Edward Reagan.
Where were your parents living then? Where was their home? Here in
They were from Ohio.
But your dad and Jane, where were they living here in
Beverly
LA?
Hills.
In Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was 3 days old, so what do I know? I'm 3 days old, and there you have it. I didn't find out I was adopted till, gosh, I think I was like 4 or 5, and that was because Maureen decided to dump that one on me. Yeah, we all went to boarding school. All the kids went to boarding school back in those days. The parents found out real early, we don't want you at home. We want you out of here. And they're actors, so they can't be home. They're on location. So we had nannies, we had maids, and when school started, we went to boarding school. I went to Chadwick up in Palos Verdes Peninsula, I think in first grade. Maureen was already there. But because I was home more than she was, her birthday being January 4th, I knew what she was getting for her birthday. And when she came home for Christmas, I said to her, I know what you're getting for your birthday. And Maureen said, I don't want to know. I said, but I know what you're getting for your birthday. She said, I don't want to know. I said, I know what you're getting. She said, if you tell me a secret, I'm going to tell you one. I said, you're getting a blue dress. And she said, you were adopted. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I went like, okay. We went down to talk to Mom, what's adopted? And that's how I found out.
To this day, I guess that partially explains why to this day you are such an advocate for adoption and for foster care, right?
Foster care, adoption. It's really important to me. I have a birth sister from my birth father's side who lives in Georgia. We're great friends, Terry. Yeah, it's nice to have that kind of friendship. We talk to each other, on a regular basis. Barry and I talk more than Terry and I, but it's really nice to have that relationship. They knew about me before I knew about them.
During this time, did your dad did they have the ranch out in Malibu at the time?
Yeah, I grew up on that ranch. We actually had 2 ranches here. We had one up there like Devonshire and Reseda. We had like 8 acres there, Yearling Row. Dad sold that and bought what became Yearling Row 2, if you will, about 360 acres in Malibu by Malibu Lake. And when I grew up on that one. So I was always riding horses with Dad there and what have you from time I was 8 years old. And then Dad sold that to the state when he was governor. He put together the Reagan Ranch, the Schaefer Ranch, and 20th Century Fox Ranch, and formed Malibu Creek State Park. So that's why it's state park. And he took that money and bought what would become Rancho del Cielo, which was Tip Top Ranch up there in Santa Barbara, Goleta area.
Your dad, you mentioned riding. I mean, he really was kind of a stud. I mean, he was a man's man.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, he was out on the ranch. He cut his own firewood. You didn't do it for him. He cut the trees down. I bought him his first chainsaw. And the next year, Nancy calls me. She says, "Do they have a bigger chainsaw?" And I went like, "Geez, Nancy, you're not happy?" So I always tell the oak trees when I visit the ranch up in Santa Barbara, it's not my fault. I just bought the saw. He's the one that used it. But no, because own firewood. If you want to spend time with my father, you learned how to swim, and he would teach you when you were very young, because he was a lifeguard. You learned to ride a horse, cut firewood. If you did those things, you spend an inordinate amount of time, and in the afternoon, go out with him and shoot ground squirrels. And that's what you did.
As Chris and I were watching this documentary a couple of days ago, they talked about him being a lifeguard. He loved being a lifeguard, it sounds like, and he saved a lot of lives.
Steve, any young, good-looking kid loves to be a lifeguard. All right. Okay, let's be honest here. College kid, lifeguard at a river or a lake, beach. Like my dad said, he saved 77 lives. But he said, I believe some of those young ladies that I saved weren't really drowning. They really just wanted to meet the lifeguard.
Oh gosh. Gosh. Okay, so when did Nancy come into your dad's life? How old were you when she came into the picture?
I was like 5,
Really?
5, 6, yeah, 5, 6 years old. Yeah, my dad and mom divorced in 1948. You know, mom had another child, Christine, who died at 3 days old. And premature birth. Dad was in the hospital with pneumonia, so he wasn't there. And many people think that probably was generated the issues that caused the divorce a few months later. But I was 5, 6 years old when Nancy came into it. Yeah.
Wow. Do you
Which, by the way, just think, that's not easy for a child. You know, too many the kids, all of a sudden, new people are thrown into a relationship, and people think you're expected to love everybody all right away. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You're kind of like, you have to grow into these things. I mean, all of a sudden, you got a stepmother and a mother, and there's a whole lot of guilt goes on. If I'm nice over here, is that going to cause a problem over there? And so it's not easy on a child. A lot of people should really consider and think about that. I write in my book, Twice Adopted, page 37, I think it is.
By the way,
I read that book.
before you go on, shameless plug. There's Michael Reagan, Twice Adopted.
There you go.
And then here's The City on a Hill.
Oh my gosh, that's it.
So
You learned how to read. Great.
Well,
you could sing and read.
I thought you'd give them to me, but you made me buy them. So anyway, if people
Well,
can go.
page 37 of that book, if you read it, it talks about, you know, divorce is when two people walk into their child's room, take everything that child loves and knows and respects and what have you, smashes it on the floor, walks out and expects the child to put it back together. That's not the way, it doesn't happen that way. I mean, it's tough on a child.
Yeah.
And I think we all went through that. I went through it. Maureen went through it. We all went through it.
So what was your relationship after your parents divorced? What was your relationship with Jane? Did it
Oh, my relationship with Jane was great. I mean, my relationship with Jane was good. I mean, I boarded at school. The 1 year, and you've heard me talk about the 1 year that she took me out of boarding school and put me into a day school. She also put me into an after school program with a camp counselor when I was in 3rd grade, 8 years old. And you know, it didn't take long, and that camp counselor would end up, you know, sexually abusing me, you know, for the better part of 3rd grade, actually all of 3rd grade, and ultimately taking photographs of me in the Santa Monica Mountains, and then having me, taking me to his apartment one night under the guise of taking me out to dinner. And he would develop a photograph in front of me. I had never seen anything like that. It was magic to an 8, 9-year-old child. And he said, would you like to do that? And I said, oh yeah. And he put tongs in my hand, paper in the tongs, and then had moved my left arm from pan to pan to 3rd pan. And what came up was a nude picture of me that he had taken in the Santa Monica Mountains. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, wouldn't your mother like to have a copy of this? And I will tell you, that day I walked away from mom, I walked away from dad, I walked away from God, I walked away from everything. And didn't start recovering until I met Colleen. So I didn't finish college, went through 5th grade twice, but I was a smart kid the second time through. But again, it just really, it destroyed my life. And I think about it all the time. Oh, I only wish I had this head then instead of a 8-year-old, 9-year-old head on. And I have no friends from my childhood because I was afraid if my friends found out what I knew about me, they wouldn't be my friends anyway. So I really had no friends. My mom and I still had a relationship with her, but it was never really that close. I would yell, get mad, scream. My grades, went down in school. That's why I had a fifth grade and junior in high school, and what have you. It's a terrible thing. I go out and speak on those issues, as you know. It takes a child 7 times to tell an adult what happened to them before the first adult listens. Before the first adult listens, it takes 7 times for a child to say anything. So let me ask, how many times you tell somebody something before you just walk away and say, I'm done. I'm done with it. So I was scared to death when my dad ran for governor and when he ran for president, that those photographs would in fact come out. In fact, I wrote in my first book, On the Outside Looking In, I wrote that if the photographs would come out before the book was published, I wouldn't be around for the first interview because suicide would be an option.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, I'm taking in what you shared there. I think when you and I were out doing an event together in Evansville, Indiana, you shared how with adoption and foster care, if the church would step up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If each church would just take care of, adopt one child, a lot of the problem would be solved in terms of adoption.
60% of the children in foster care will end up on the streets, jail, or being human sex trafficked. 60%. The next time you go to Evansville and you fly there, if the pilot takes your ticket at the door and says to you, Steve, welcome aboard, 60% of the time you crash on the way to destination, would you still sit on the plane? Or would you in fact say, I'm not getting on that plane? But 60% of the kids end up in street, jail, or being human sex trafficked. Even Dr. Phil, if you ever watch Dr. Phil's show, because he's on the board, he tells these families that are dealing with children, you don't want your kid to be in foster care. You do not want that to happen. You need to do everything you can to make sure they don't go to foster care. That's not the place they survive. And it's so sad that the church used to be really involved back in the day. They used to have the trains that would leave out of the East Coast to go across the country. And they would stop at little towns across country, and the children who were available for adoption, their photos would be taken and sent along to the churches. And the churches would show up when the train would stop. And the people would be there to adopt the children. In fact, the children, because they were so small, they would take the children, when they would take them off the train, they would stand them on the boxes you see around train stations. Yeah. And that's where the verbiage comes, up for adoption. They would take the children, put them on these boxes. They were up for adoption. And then one day the trains were showing up with kids and the churches were no longer there. And then the government has to come in and say, oh, we could solve the problem. And so the government comes in and look at the problem they've not solved because of what's happening, to our children. The churches really need to be involved. They need to look at the foster care system in their city where they live and say, what can we do to mentor or to adopt and bring these children in? I feel for the kids all over the world, but we also have kids in America. And unfortunately, people have this feeling that kids who are in foster care have done something terribly wrong. A 3-year-old doesn't do things so terribly wrong. They're taken out of the home and put into foster care.
What someone told me, I think it was last week, that they shared some things about the Child Protective Services around the country that is not real positive about some of these services in different cities. Mm-hmm. That sometimes they're as much part of the problem in foster care. And I don't know if you know much about that, but it was kind of disturbing to hear this. So
yeah, don't Google foster care and all that and get the stories every day. You'll just go, oh my God. I mean, really, CPS, but they're all government-run programs. I mean, look at the kids here. A couple of years ago here in Los Angeles, out in the Antelope Valley. The kid was under the guise of CPS, and the parents beat him to death. And how many times you have to go to a house and take a child out? Why do you put him back in? And then you're not getting the greatest people in the world running the operation. They don't care. It's just numbers to them and money. I get money, just numbers.
Okay,
It's
so
what it is. And the children end up paying the price. And that's why I say the churches need to be there for these kids. Bring them in and adopt these kids. Give them a home. Give them a life. You know where I get in trouble though? And I may be in trouble with you. I think it's outrageous that we Christians will stand up and say we don't want gays adopted. If you're a 5 or 6 year old child, think about this. The minimum number of homes you're going to go through in your lifetime in foster care is about 13 homes. 13 homes. And you say, why is that child so angry?
Yeah.
13 homes? Now, is that child better off going through 13 homes, being aged out of foster care at 18, with no job, no life issues, and ending up in the streets, jail, or human sex traffic? Or is that child better off with Rosie O'Donnell? That child's better off with Rosie. Child's got a chance at Rosie. With Rosie, the chances are 40% the other way, and probably 100% with Rosie. And so I get in trouble with the Christian community because I espouse that and say, wait a minute, you got to think this thing through. It's about the child and giving that child a shot at life that they're not going to get coming through a foster care program.
okay, I mean, I hear that, and I think you make a valid point there. Let me ask you this. You mentioned earlier about being adopted and that you became a conservative. How is it that you became a conservative and you became a conservative and your two siblings are not conservative?
Well, you know, Patty and Ron grew up in the 60s. Ron was born in 58, Patty in 52. And I write about this in my last book, Lessons My Father Taught Me. You got, when you're in such a famous family, it's, you're trying to find your identity. Who are you? Everybody always asks you about your parents. Who are you? And, your boarding school or whatever it might be. Think about Patty, born in 1952. At the ripe old age of about 13, you got kids. Think about a 13-year-old daughter who you've gone swimming with, rode horses with, done all these things with him. All of a sudden he decides to run for governor. And no longer is he that family guy anymore because he's got to be out campaigning.
Oh.
He's got to be somewhere else on Saturday night or Sunday or Friday night. Those times you used to have with your dad aren't there because he's got to be at this event or that event. And then what happens? He wins. And what happens then? You're asked to leave your home and move to another city, another place you've never been, and make new friends at 13. Now, how happy are you? You're not that happy at all because you're missing all your friends. Ron was born in 1958. He's 7 years old, when they moved to Sacramento. So, I had, and Maureen had. Maureen was born in 1941. I was born in 45. So Maureen had 24 years. I had 20 before he ran for governor of riding horses, shooting ground squirrels, swimming, riding out to the ranch any given Saturday, listening to my dad sing all the songs, the military songs, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, telling me about America. All these, I had 20 years of that. They didn't get that before the government showed up and really took a lot of their childhood away.
So how did life change for you when your dad became governor?
When he became governor, not really that much, except that a lot of people don't think you ever needed to work. Your dad becomes governor, well, you don't need a job. Your dad's governor.
Oh.
And I found out the night he was elected, he didn't believe in nepotism, which was terrible. I thought after learning, he actually told me that he didn't believe in nepotism because I asked him for a job on election night. And I thought to myself, I went home that night thinking I should have voted for the other guy. Because they certainly did believe in nepotism. Why did a guy adopt me doesn't believe in nepotism? That's nuts. But no, it changes because everything you do is blown up, if you will. And it's being the son of a governor, because at that point I was 21 years old. So I was on my own and living on my own and what have you.
So what did you do for work? What did you do during those years?
Oh, when my dad became governor, my parents had a birth defect. They believed in a work ethic, which is terrible for a kid from Beverly Hills. My mother taught me very early at 10 years of age, if I wanted a bike, I needed to get a job to pay for it. So I actually signed a note with my mother at 10 years of age for a 10-speed bike. And I sold papers in front of Good Shepherd Church in Beverly Hills on Sunday morning to pay her back for the money she loaned me for the bike. And I asked her, I said, why didn't you give it to me like all the other kids are getting their bikes given to them? She says, because I build men, not boys. I don't want you to be 40 years old to be a child. I want you to be a man. And that's what she told me when I was like 10 years old. When my dad became governor, I was actually working on a trucking dock in LA, Asbury Transportation Company in Vernon, California, loading oil well freight from 5 at night to 1:30 in the morning. And the other guys on the dock used to tell me my parents didn't love me. I said, they do. No, they don't. I said, why do you think my parents don't love me? They'd say, Reagan, you're working in Vernon, California on a trucking dock. Your mother's Jane Wyman. Your father's about ready to become governor of the state, and you're working on a trucking dock? You think they love you? You're crazy. And I said, maybe you're right. So anyway, that's where I was working, a trucking dock in LA. And I just moved around job to job to job. I actually worked for a company called Matrix Science Corporation for a while. I was a draftsman on what we call a 553 BDL connector. You don't know what it is, but it is the connector that disconnects the Saturn V rocket from that little ship that ended up landing on the moon. So I did that. So I kind of the jack of all trades. What do you need to do?
Well,
Started racing boats.
Yeah, I was going to go there. How in the world did you? Probably most people don't know that you raced boats. How did that happen?
A friend of mine invited me to a race at Salton Sea, California.
Yeah.
I said, this is kind of neat. The foreman's son from the ranch, Dick Jackin, and guys, this is fun. Maybe we could do it. So we ended up pulling our money. We bought a boat. Ralph Williams Ford sponsored the engine. Holman Moody built it for me. So I had my sponsor on my engine, got a car from Ralph Williams Ford, now with Galpin and all that stuff, and we started racing. 1966, I was the inboard powerboat rookie of the year, powerboating. They invited me to race in the Outboard World Championship in 1967 at Lake Havasu. And they did this because this is the deal. Your dad's governor, so you got a name. McCullough Oil owned Lake Havasu. Be great press for McCullough Oil. They had Pete Knight in the race. They had myself. So they had land speed record, flying record, and now the son of the governor. And so I went to my boat builder, Racing Craft, Rudy Ramus, got an outboard boat he had there under a tarp, got Mercury Motors to give us 3 1250 BP Mercs, put together Rudy Ramus, myself, and one other driver. And we decided to get in the race. and they promoted we're going to be in the race. And the night before the race in the Calcutta, my boat went for $13. Nobody thought I had a chance to win. Governor's son's not going to do anything. He's going to fail, but it's great publicity. We'll have you here. Wonderful. So the press is following all these other people. And it's a 2-day race, 4 hours Saturday, 4 hours Sunday. At the end of Saturday, we're the only Mercury in first place. Only Mercury top 10. We're in first. All of a sudden, Mercury loves us again. What can we do to make you better tomorrow? And we end up winning the Outboard Championship 1967. When the press figured it out in the last 2 hours, they're running up because we're changing drivers when we're going back in. And then, can you get out of the boat and get one more? I said, I'm trying to win a race. This is not a photo op. I said, I got a bigger kiss from the guy who bought my boat in Calcutta than I did from the queen of the race. He gave me a bigger kiss. What a lot of money.
Did you ever crash in one of those things?
I crashed, I think in 1969. I had a brand new racing crab, big crush motor, Keith Black Chrysler engine in it, about 119 miles an hour down in Galveston, Texas. Raced. Unfortunately, I was in the lead and everybody saw it. So my dad called me the next morning and said, have you ever thought about selling boats?
But
I said, yeah, I never thought about that. But I sold cars for a while, ended up selling boats in the 70s and Sea Ray boats, did that. And when my dad became president, couldn't find a job.
Why?
Ukraine didn't even call me. But you get so many, trust me, you get more calls of that sort than you shake stick at. But you're walking around with 6 guys with guns, Secret Service. They're with you 24/7, and it's not easy. Who's going to hire you? And so I had to recreate myself again. And Chloe and I started a little company where I would go out and do fundraising for different charitable causes. And the first one we figured would be the United States Olympic team. And I called my good friend Larry Smith and Wellcraft Boats. Had a Scarab, 38-foot Scarab, 3 Evinrude V8s on it. And I got some sponsorship money. And we set the world record between New Orleans and St. Louis on the Mississippi River.
No.
1982, 83. Raised $500,000, United States Olympic team, largest single fundraiser they've ever had. We went on to do another one on the Great Lakes between Chicago and Detroit. We do Ketchikan, Alaska, and Seattle for cystic fibrosis, raised $250,000 for them. We ended up raising about almost $2 million for charities doing these world records. I think I still hold the world record from San Francisco to LA.
Man, you mentioned your dad becoming president.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked at lunch over the years, and I don't know if you still think this now, but years ago you said to me, today my dad couldn't get elected. Do you still believe that? And help people understand why you believe that, if so.
Well, it's a different time. My dad, it was optimism. It's always morning in America and what have you. And I think I told you at lunch, this is the guy who gave amnesty to those who were here illegally. That would not fly today in talk radio or the conservative side. It wouldn't fly at all. He most likely would, I know that in fact, he would not send DACA kids home. He would not blame the kids who were brought here as children by their mothers and fathers and babies who have never lived anywhere else. He would not send them home. He would find a way to give them a path to citizenship. That wouldn't fly today, with the Republican Party. There's a lot of parts of it that would, but those are big parts of the party anymore. And he would find it very hard, most likely, to get the nomination. If he got the nomination, he'd probably be elected, but it's getting through the nomination process now, which is much different than it was back then, because you have all these outlets with talk radio, with the television networks. Remember when he ran, there was 3 stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was it. Now everybody's got a television station. or whatever they've got. And if you don't agree on all the issues, boy, they just eat you up alive. I'd like to think he could, but I think he'd have much trouble getting the nomination of the party to get through to win the election.
What do you think he'd think about the political process these days and how things work in the political system?
I don't think he'd like the tenor. He would think that social media has just changed the tenor of politics. He was never into personal attacks. I go back, I talk about him and Tip O'Neill when the largest tax break in American history was passed. But how'd that happen? My father calls Tip O'Neill, invites him and his wife to the White House for dinner. The next day, Tip O'Neill will go back to his staff and say, I'm going to carry the legislation for the president on the tax break. And they look at Tip, they go, Tip, you lost your mind? If you put it on the floor, it'll pass because of all the blue dog Democrats, back then they were boll weevils. They'll pass it. You know that. He says, I know that, but I'm going to do it. Why? What did the president promise you? What did he say to you last night that caused this to happen? He said, I went up there for dinner. He never talked about taxes all night long. He never spoke of taxes? Well, what did he talk about? The greatness of America, the goodness of her people, and how the two of us working together can make it better for all. Yeah. Before I knew it, I'm having a glass of wine with the president. We're telling Irish stories. Today, I'm telling him I'm going to carry the legislation. That's the way my dad was. That doesn't really happen anymore, where you do reach across the aisle. You're able to bring people in and negotiate to an extent, because everybody's gotten so polarized, left or right, just polarization, that nothing gets really taken care of, and everybody in the middle ends up suffering because of it.
Talk to us about the fall of the wall. You and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but the wall, tell us about the museum. Many people probably don't know about the museum there, the Checkpoint Charlie, and then to step into the Legacy Foundation and what you're about now. But start out with just the fall of the wall.
Well, you talk about the fall of the wall and what have you. You have to go back and really, it all started with a bullet that was meant to kill my father. And my father lived. First president ever shot to survive an assassin's bullet. Before he went back to the White House, what did he do? I know the groups you speak to, you know the groups I speak to. And I'll ask those groups many times, how many here can recite the Lord's Prayer? And then the next question is this one. How many of you live it? More people say it than live it. Mm. Ronald Reagan lived it. Why? Because before he went back to the White House, he forgave John Hinckley for trying to kill him. And he recited the Lord's Prayer. 3 months later, Pope John Paul is shot in Rome. Pope John Paul, before he goes back to the Vatican, what does he do? He lives the Lord's Prayer because he forgives the man who tried to shoot him. And he says the Lord's Prayer and goes back. A couple of months later, Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul meet for the first time and begin a relationship that almost was daily in conversation. Both of them recommitted their lives to God. Both of them felt that they survived the assassin's bullet for a higher purpose. And they worked together, first Poland, to free Poland, that ultimately would bring down the Berlin Wall. But my dad, everybody in my dad's administration, hierarchy of administration, didn't want him to say, tear down this wall. They were too worried about, they didn't want to upset Mikhail Gorbachev. Well, my dad, because he wrote most of his speeches, knew exactly where that line was and made sure he put it in there. And today, because of our foundation, working with my father's foundation, up on the hill in Simi Valley, we now have a plaque in the ground at the Brandenburg Gate commemorating that speech of June 12, 1987. And my foundation, my wife's foundation, the Reagan Legacy Foundation, were able to put in a Reagan exhibit at the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, overlooking Checkpoint Charlie there in Berlin, and we did that on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall. But it's because those two people were able to get together and think about, not about themselves, but think about the future of the world, and thought that they've survived for a larger, bigger purpose, that ultimately it would bring freedom to that area of the world.
The wall would not have come down without the Pope and your dad.
You're right. And Margaret Thatcher and what have you, but really it was the Pope and my father, because they had to start somewhere, and they started in Poland. It was just from that point forward. And I remember that the Margaret Thatcher, after my dad's funeral, the next morning we would see each other and have breakfast, and she would say, think what we could have accomplished had your father been elected in 76. I said, Lady Thatcher, the wall would still be up, the Cold War would still be going on. She said, why? I said, I think God chooses his moments. So why do you say that? I said, my dad was elected in 1976. Where were you? Where's Pope John Paul? Where was Lech Walesa? Where's Václav Havel? Where was Mikhail Gorbachev, who didn't come into play till 85? None of you were in place. If he serves 2 terms, he's out before Mikhail Gorbachev takes over the Soviet Union. And the next leader would not have done that. Come on board. I said, I think God chooses his moments. And he chose his moment to be 1980 because now Margaret Thatcher's in place. Pope John Paul's in place. Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, and ultimately the stage is set for Mikhail Gorbachev. And what happens? Peace breaks out, the wall comes down. 1980 was the time God chose. 76 is the time man chose. God was right, we were wrong. She said, I never thought of it that way. Thank you. I said, thank you.
I'm guessing that's one of those times. I remember distinctly where I was that night. I was in Nashville. It was right before Thanksgiving, and I was in Nashville preparing for a concert. I was with the conductor. I was with Ron Huff. We were going over music for the concert, and somehow we caught word of this, and we went into his den and turned on the television, seeing people standing on the wall and then tearing that down. It was just, it's one of those moments of history for each of us that is so profound. Are you still?
I love traveling over that area of the world, Germany, where we have the exhibit. You know, we now have a brick project at Normandy, France, at St. Mary Glees. People go online to ReaganLegacyFoundation.org, if they will. And
Say
look
that one more time. What's the
ReaganLegacyFoundation.org.
Okay.
Go there. And we have a brick project. People go online, actually purchase a brick in the name of a loved one who served in the Second World War European theater. And we're bricking in there at St. Mary Glees at the museum there. St. Mary Glees, first town freed by America on D-Day morning. If you saw Longest Day red buttons hanging from the church steeple in St. Mary Glees, it's where all the paratroopers are going. That would be the 101st and 82nd Airborne's, big deal. That was their Gettysburg. And it's an amazing place to visit. And the Airborne Museum we've worked with now, and it's nice to see these bricks with the names of someone who served European theater, maybe landed on D-Day, what regiment they were with, and what have you. So we're doing that whole brick thing at Normandy, France. Yeah, it's great.
Are you still? I know there's a period where you were bringing students. You're engaging with students, European students. Are you still doing that?
No, we can't do that because of insurance. Because of insurance, we did it one time, changed the lives. Can't not tell you the lives we changed. With the kids, we were able to take over that area of the world and introduce them. But insurance just got to be so prohibitive. You can't raise enough money to pay for the insurance if something happens to a child or what have you. So we had to stop the program. We took a group of kids over to Europe one year, and we brought a bunch of kids from Europe here. In fact, the next year, and we just had to stop.
one of the other things that is a memory for me was your dad's funeral. And I'd love anything behind the scenes on that, you know, starting in Washington, D.C., and then coming here. And I remember Pastor Michael Venning was, I think, your parents' pastor for a period of time. And I remember that service. I was so impressed with him that he gave a clear presentation of the gospel. Tell us about those final days of your dad's life, and maybe anything about that final memorial.
Well, I mean, it was amazing just to see the outpouring of the world, if you will. I didn't realize till I got up to speak that day that I would be the first one to really talk about Jesus and my dad. Because I was so in zone. I remember we landed at Point Magoo that day. And you think about this, my father never flew on a plane from the end of the Second World War until he ran for governor, because he thought that God gave you so many air miles and he used them all up during the Second World War. And ultimately he had to start flying if he wanted to become governor.
Uh-huh.
So I was thinking about that, the fact that the last time we all saw Dad, he was on Air Force One flying back to California for a guy who didn't like to fly until he ran for governor. So I remember we're on that plane flying back with Dad and the family, and everybody was in their own compartments. And I knew I was going to be the first one to speak. And so I just found myself alone. I got a piece of paper and got a little pencil, and I'm starting to write down some ideas. And my daughter, Ashley, walks in and said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to speak. I better make this good. I need to write some notes." And Ashley said, "Dad, you've never written a speech. Don't ruin this one and write it." Okay. And I put the paper away. Never thought about the rest of the time. Lay at Point Magoo, and there was 2 messages on my phone. One was from Mark Larson, a friend of mine, down in San Diego.
Yeah.
And another one from another friend of mine from church. Both of them knowing I would be the first one to speak. Both of them offering up prayers that I would find the right words. And I listened to those messages, and seriously, Steve, as I'm tearing up here, because as we're driving off of Magoo, a voice comes to me and says, "All week long, we've heard about a president. Let them hear about your dad." But it doesn't affect me. And those, I swear those are the words I heard. And I put it away, locked it in. And so when I asked to get up and speak, I had no idea where I was going to start. No idea. But I just started and flowed. Remember Sean Handy called me that night, said, "Do you have a copy of that speech?" I said, "What speech? What you gave today?" I said, "No." "Well, where are your notes?" He said, "I watched that whole thing." He said, "Michael, I've watched that 15 times. You never looked down at your notes." I said, "I didn't have any." "You gave that speech with no notes?" I said, "Yeah, no notes. It's just what came from my heart about my dad, about me coming into the family, and that relationship, and really how lucky I was, and the fact that knowing that he was in heaven with my sister, and that we would all be together again. But so people prayed for me. My life would not be what it is if I didn't have people praying for me all the time. You know that because I tell you to pray for me all the time as I pray for you. My wife, Colleen, love of my life, be 45 years in November. Had she not come in my life, I don't know where I, in fact, would be. She's the one that shook me to the core and said, quit being angry at God. She's the one that really shook me, said, quit blaming God for everything in your life that goes wrong. It's time to start accepting. And got me back into church and on a regular basis. And it really probably worked so well. My dad's and my relationship at the end, he had Alzheimer's, but our relationship at the end was as good as it was when I was a kid growing up 8 years old. Because even though we couldn't converse verbally, we learned to hug. And when I would see him, I would hug him hello, and he would hug me hello. And even though he couldn't say my name, he remembered I was the guy who in fact hugged him. And I got that because I was at church one day, Steve, and I was mad and angry still. And I was saying, how many people have done this? If you can get your father to tell, if you get my father to tell me he loves me, I will serve you. And I said, if you get my father to tell me he loves me, I will serve you. Boys get back. So when was the last time you told your father you loved him? And I realized in 1991, 92, I never told my father I loved him. Ever. Ever. But I was mad and angry because he hadn't told me he loved me. And God spoke to me again and said, next time you see him, give him a hug and tell him you love him. And he came down to my radio show to be interviewed by me on his book, An American Life. And I fulfilled that promise to God. I went up to my dad and I put my arms around him and I hugged him and said, I love you. You know what he said? Well, I love you too. And I thought to myself, what have I been doing? What have I been doing that I've been using that as an excuse for failure? And so every time I saw my dad from that point on, I would hug him hello and hug him goodbye. And when Colleen and I went up to visit Nancy one day, because you couldn't visit Dad any longer because of the disease, but he would be there. We got up to leave and got to our car. And Colleen said, you forgot something. I said, what did I forget? She said, look at the door. I turned around, I looked at the door of the house. And there standing in the door of the house with his arms open like this was my dad. I had forgotten to hug him goodbye. He had remembered I had forgotten. I didn't have Alzheimer's. He did. And I ran back to that door, wrapped my arms around my dad, gave him a squeeze, said, I love you, Dad. Squeezed me, turned around, took those little baby short steps with Nancy's help back into the den and sat down. I'm blessed.
Mike, I want to thank you for your time today, for being vulnerable with us and giving us that really wonderful story. I do this, I've been doing this with the other conversations I've been having with folks, and I want to close this time with you in the same way. Heavenly Father, I pray for Michael today. For him and his family, I pray for health over his family. I thank you for his willingness to be a witness of you. I pray that you would post angels all around his house right now of protection and of healing and of health, that you would give him even greater impact as he seeks to follow you. Help us to hug people, understand that we are to reflect your love, and that some people will not come to know you without us expressing your grace and your love to them. So I thank you for Michael, and I pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Mike Reagan, I love you.
Love you too, man. Be well.
Thank you.
Love you, the family. Bye-bye.